Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Spiros Economides, and I'm a co-chair of LSEE, the LSEE's research unit on Southeast Europe. And I welcome you to this webinar this afternoon, which is on the very important topic of nationalism in Southeast Europe today. We have an extremely eminent group of panelists who are going to be introduced in a second by my friend and colleague, Professor Jasna Dragovie-Soso, who will be chairing this afternoon's event. But before handing over to Jasna, could I just make a few administrative announcements? The first is that this is a recording. This is a webinar which is being recorded and will be later put on our website as a podcast for those of you who are interested in following it later on. We are also streaming on Facebook, and those of you who are participating on Facebook can put questions through the comment sections. We will pick them up and they will be put to our panelists. For those of you watching on the Zoom link, please keep in mind that there is a Q&A, a question and answer function at the bottom of the screen. When the Q&A session starts at the end of the panelists' presentations, please use that feature to ask your questions and provide a name and an affiliation, otherwise your question may not be taken. And those of you who feel obliged to tweet, the Twitter handle you can use today is #LSEE Balkans. Again, welcome to this afternoon's webinar. And now could I please hand you over to the chair of this afternoon's meeting, Professor Jasna Dragovie-Soso, who's a professor of international politics and history at Goldsmiths College, but is also a visiting professor at the European Institute at the London School of Economics. Jasna.
Thank you very much, Spiros. So as Spiros said, the topic of this evening's roundtable is nationalism in Southeastern Europe today. And as attested by the events of the last several years in the region, as well as more recently, this topic is both an important and a burning one. To mention briefly, just in the last few months, we have seen the resurgence of controversies about the Second World War and about the wars of the 1990s in a variety of cultural products, media, publications, and public exchanges. There have also been renewed calls for partition and territorial exchanges in the region, and of course, the continuing official rehabilitation of convicted war criminals. During the last decade, we have also witnessed the crisis of liberalism in the West, in the United States and the EU, which was accompanied by forms of nationalism and nationalist discourses that many had viewed as the preserve of the Balkan other. And I think this in turn begs the question of how unique nationalism in Southeast Europe really is and what we can learn from it more generally. So our panel this evening to discuss this topic is comprised of three very illustrious academics who are long-standing analysts of the politics, the history, and the sociology of the region, as well as authors of important books on nationalism. Florian Bieber is Professor of Southeast European History and Politics and Jean Monnet Chair at the University of Graz, where he's also the director of the Center for Southeast European Studies. Florian is also the coordinator of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, known under the acronym BIEPAG, which is a widely consulted source of information about the region. His most recent books, both published in 2020, are Debating Nationalism with Bloomsbury and The Rise of Authoritarianism in the Western Balkans with Palgrave. And he is also the author of many other publications on Southeast European politics and society. He has a further book coming out with Palgrave in 2021, co-authored with Roland Bieber, called Negotiating Unity and Diversity in the European Union. Dejan Jovic is Professor of Political Science at the University of Zagreb and visiting professor at the University of Belgrade. Between 2010 and 2014, he was chief political analyst to the President of the Republic of Croatia. Dejan is the author of Yugoslavia, a state that withered away, with Purdue University Press, and Rat I Mit, War and Myth, Politics of Identity in Croatia, which was published in Croatian with Fraktura in 2017, quickly sold out, and is now in its second edition. Earlier this year, it received the Krunoslav Sukic Award for Book of the Decade in Croatia. Until recently, Dejan was the editor-in-chief of the Croatian Political Science Review, Politička Misao, and is now the editor of Dragovie Footprints, Journal for Serbian and Croatian Issues. Sinisa Malesevic is full professor and chair of sociology at the University College Dublin. He is a senior fellow at Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers in Paris, and currently a research fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities and Social Sciences in Amsterdam. He is an elected member of the Royal Irish Academy and the Academia Europea. His recent books include Contemporary Sociological Theory with Stephen Loyal, which came out last October, his 2019 book, Grounded Nationalisms, A Sociological Analysis, and his 2017 book, The Rise of Organized Brutality, A Historical Sociology of Violence, both with Cambridge University Press. The Rise of Organized Brutality won the American Sociological Association's Outstanding Book Award in 2018, and Grounded Nationalisms was a runner-up for the 2020 Steenrocken Prize for the Comparative Social Science Research. Sinisa is the author of 10 books, 8 edited volumes, and over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and his work has been translated into 13 languages. I'm absolutely delighted they have accepted our invitation to take part in this discussion, and without further ado, I turn over to Florian.
Well, thank you, Jasna, for having us, putting this panel together, and this is your brainchild, and also for Spiros and LSE for organizing and hosting us, even though it would have been nicer to be at LSE at this moment than virtually. And also, of course, I mean, I guess I'm happy about the invitation, not happy about the causes, which Jasna, you've outlined already so kind of succinctly why we're talking about this particular topic. So, you know, I wish we could move away or have a purely historical debate about nationalism in Southeastern Europe, and not one where we have to deal with the contemporary. So this is, in a certain way, not a very fortunate theme we'll have to engage with today. And I mean, the first step I would like to say is that, you know, I don't see anything specific to Southeastern Europe when we're talking about nationalism. I mean, of course, there are particular specificities in terms of historical references, political dynamics in the present, but the overall phenomena is, of course, nothing unique and nothing special. And I think this is one very important one, especially as we're discussing a particular region, that we have to also be aware not to fall into the trap of uniqueness and specificity, and rather recognize that the phenomena we're looking at have their historical record in the region, but are not limited to it. And I mean, Jasna, as you already said, you know, we are first of all in an environment where certain expressions of nationalism have become more common in a number of countries. And you know, I think first of all, maybe it's a question of defining what we're talking about, because the problem in this is, I mean, Sinisa has worked on this extensively, the way in which we understand nationalism. And, you know, it has these multiple layers. There are these dimensions of nationalism, which is the everyday, the banal nationalism, the flying the flag, the buy British, buy American, and so on, which is ubiquitous and quite different in terms of intensity and exclusion than the more kind of violent exclusionary types of nationalism. So, first of all, I would like to say that this other type of nationalism is present in many societies kind of nearly constantly, as we're living in a nationwide organized world. But the question is really more the kind of exclusionary and potentially virulent nationalism we're talking about. So nationalisms which are explicitly excluding and emphasizing the exclusionary dimension, and which are also potentially either violent or highly politicized and highly polarizing. So this is how I would narrow it down. So of course, this is something we've seen globally on the rise. And I would, you know, and I've looked at this on a global scale. I think it's, of course, impossible to say there's a single global picture. The world is too diverse, luckily, to allow for such a global assessment. We've seen it mostly rise in European countries in North America, with some traces elsewhere, like in India. But of course, very often we have to, and I've argued that it's very hard to disentangle the reinforcement of nationalism with authoritarianism and populism. And I think they form a triad which really work together and are mutually reinforcing. So sometimes nationalist politicians are not elected because they're nationalists. They're not elected because they're authoritarian, but they might use both strategies as ways to retain power and influence. And of course, the causes are not nationalism itself. I mean, we know this very well from the studies of the 1990s Yugoslav wars, that nationalism did not emerge, that it wasn't the cause, but it was more the consequence of something else, of a erosion of legitimacy, erosion of state, a crisis of a ruling system in many ways. And nationalism is not the cause, but the consequence. And I think also here now in today's world, nationalism is maybe a consequence. It's not a cause by itself. It's caused by a multitude of factors, which is very hard to kind of capture in a single description. And I think what we're dealing with is that some of the global phenomena we're seeing manifest in Southeastern Europe. And they, of course, manifest in something which is the past, which has not been fully dealt with. And the wars of the 1990s and the Second World War are resources of which are talked about and are highly controversial and contested in a certain way, historical events. And unfortunately, the period between the wars themselves and the present have not sufficed and have not led to the processes necessary to deal with them. And this means that now you can have the rehabilitation of war criminals, you can have a constant reminder of the antagonisms of war, you can have hate speech in newspapers, and all of the kind of hallmarks which we observed before the wars in the 1990s are witnessable in following public debates in the post-Yugoslav space today. Now, and I think Dejan might speak more to that because this book, Rat i mit, is I think very extensively devoted and an excellent study on that topic. But I think just to kind of have it as an introductory thoughts is very much that this is still, it's not just that it is still present. I mean, I would say in many ways the past is still present in the region, but it's not that it's just still, but it's more present. So it's not a constant, but it's becoming more present, I find, in recent years in the public discourse, in the antagonism. And we could talk about many examples, the way in which Oluya is discussed in Serbia, for example, the way in which we see also the glorification, for example, of the army, the Yugoslav army in the Kosovo War through a number of movies. And these kind of celebrations, commemorations, popular culture are all pulling in a similar direction, which is a very nationalist, one-sided view, and one which is also now consumed by a new generation who have not experienced either Yugoslavia or the wars of the 1990s in any substantial way. And so this is really a context which, of course, we have to be careful. I think there's people were thinking in the 90s or before the wars of the 90s often through the lens of earlier conflicts. And we have to be careful not to think of the present through the lens of exclusively of the 1990s. I wouldn't argue in any way that there is a threat of a recurrence of the violence of the 1990s. So we shouldn't fall into the trap to, see conflict and nationalism in an exclusionary way exclusively through the lens of past experience. But I think what we can say is that this kind of polarization and the difficulty of having any kind of substantial, meaningful debate about it. This is, I think, the space. I mean, of course, there are the groups of people who are having these debates. I mean, we are having this debate, and there are many excellent historians and social scientists who are having those debates. Those networks exist, but they did exist in the 80s as well, and the early 90s as well. So it's not that the presence of these networks is in itself a defense against the malign effects of exclusionary and radical nationalism, but rather that is the one which is more visible in media, the kind of nationalist, kind of very, very ideological, dogmatic historians or scholars are often more present in the public sphere. And I think this is, again, where we're coming about we have to discuss that nationalism is often not a cause, but a result of something else, a permissible media environment, authoritarian tendencies in the region. So I think we cannot talk about nationalism as being in a certain way cause, but rather that it's triggered by a number of phenomena which come together, the weakening of the liberal European, in a certain way, post-war order, especially in Southeastern Europe, the kind of declining attraction of liberal democracy as an ideological political model. With it combined the declining attractiveness of the European Union and the fact that there are, of course, other ideas of Europe. I mean, we have an idea of Europe as promoted by people like Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, which is a Europe of nation states, which is anti-Muslim, which is anti-immigration, which is defined on the kind of anti-morales Christianitatis, or the defense wall from the Southeast ideology. And this is another vision of Europe, which is competing, not just in Hungary, but is competing on a European level, and one which resonates, picks up themes from Southeastern Europe, and again feeds to the region these ideas. So in that sense, the region is deeply communicated, deeply Europeanized when we're talking about nationalism and exchanging ideas with it. So much for now, and then I think we can continue the conversation later on.
Thank you. Dejan, would you like to continue?
Yes, why not? Thanks so much, Jasna, and thanks for the invitation to the LSE. I would start by saying that, in fact, in the last 30 years, and this is 2021, therefore 30 years since 1991, this crucial year for the post-Yugoslav area. In these 30 years, I think nationalism has been consolidated and I think shaped in a way in which it now represents and actually signifies, and it is a much more stronger political occurrence or political phenomena, more clearly defined, and I would say with more powerful instruments to achieve its main objectives than it used to be back in 1991. Maybe this I think maybe this conclusion, or a tentative conclusion, might come as a surprise, because we all remember, of course, 1991 and how violent these years were, and how we felt that actually this was also due to strong and violent nationalisms. But I think we shouldn't really confuse the violence, which in this particular case was result, in my view, of chaotic and anarchic nature of the international order, or at least the international order in this part of Europe, after its collapsing with 1989, in fact, with nationalism, with the strength of nationalism. I think nationalism was rather disorganized and I would say confused somehow, if I may use this word for something that is a doctrine and ideology. And therefore, if you look, for example, the main advocates or proponents or actors that acted on behalf of the state or a nation, I think what we actually can see in the 1990s, especially the first half of the 1990s, that they were full of ideas which kept changing with time, that could not define either the concept of a nation or a state, that couldn't really define the objectives of national politics when it comes to their newly created nation states. And I think that they were pretty much, just like many others in a general public, confused and surprised with the series of events that actually happened in 1990, 1991 in former Yugoslavia. When it comes to general public, I think we have the evidence of this in various public opinion polls done in 1990, but also in the voting behavior in 1990. We could challenge actually the notion that there was a very strong desire for independence, for their own separate nation state from Yugoslavia. I think we could certainly argue that this desire for independence by 1990 was already strong and clearly articulated in Slovenia. But when it comes to North Macedonia, as it is called now, or Montenegro or Bosnia and Herzegovina, I couldn't actually, I don't remember a very strong desire on the side either of political elites of these countries or general public for independence. And if you don't have a strong desire for independence or to create your own nation state, then of course the question is, what is the character of nationalism. Is this really Is this really nationalism? And what are we actually talking about nationalism? When there is no clear desire for statehood or for independence. When it comes to Serbia, some might be surprised. I mean, because of course there is a lot of discussion about the strength of Serbian nationalism. It's certainly Serbian political actions in the 1990s were clearly, they also involved violence and a lot of violence. But Serbia did not declare independence ever, actually. It became independent in 2006, largely due to Montenegrin desire for independence after all these previous declarations of independence back in the period from 1991 onwards. And the similar thing is with Croatia, in which, for example, now we are, I think, in May 21, there will be 30 years exactly of the rather well-known referendum on independence, which involved in the referendum question also some other options, such as, for example, a possibility for a new confederation between Croatia and other nation states. Therefore, I would say that actually, back in the 1990s, despite the violence, I think there is some space to challenge whether actually these Southeast European or post-Yugoslav nationalisms were either strong or organized or well-defined. And I think we see this. I think the line of events on the ground during this war, you could easily see that actually there is a confusion over the question of where exactly should be the state and who exactly is the nation, and what do we mean by the borders, for example, of the new states. I mean, do we accept the existing borders as they used to be in socialist Yugoslavia, or want to change it? And who do we actually see as belonging to the collective us? I mean, there are very good articles, of course, on this, largely through the prism of the citizenship policies, on the policies on citizenship. I think now, however, 30 years since, what we see is, I think, much better defined nationalisms in post-Yugoslav states. And the reason for this is not only that there are 30 years in between, and therefore they had enough time, I think, to organize themselves and to think of what is a nation and where is the border and whether it could be changed and who belongs to us and the others. But also it is due to, I think, several other factors. First of all, in some cases, some of these confused nationalisms that needed a war to strengthen the key elements of us and the other, of the otherness and the self, they got actually, to their own surprise, rather successful. They used well circumstances and support that they got from abroad, from the external actors of the time. And for example, I mean, first of all, I have in mind Slovenian case, in which, for example, when Slovenia even declared independence, I mean, we all remember that nobody recognized it for 6 or 7 months, and it took the war in Croatia basically for Slovenia to get a recognition. Therefore, this external support for independence certainly strengthened and made very successful Slovenian nationalism and the idea of independence from Yugoslavia. The same or similar cases, of course, with Croatia, which is a country in which I think we can see that nationalism, of course, was also very successful. And it was successful not only in terms of keeping the borders, receiving independence against odds in January 1992, but also achieving a high degree of ethnic homogenization in 1995 in particular. All of this with support from the outside. And it is a very big question, of course, whether the indigenous or the original domestic forces would have been powerful enough and organized enough to achieve any of these particular successes. Now, the other thing that motivates current nationalisms, so apart from successes, are failures. And failures are many, and primarily are related to the states and nations whose political leaders seem to be dissatisfied with the results of the war of the 1990s. Those who believe, for example, that the borders in which they were left with their own states, or the definition of the nation with which they are now being left, is unsatisfactory. And I think there, apart from Croatia, from Slovenia, and to a degree Croatia, we have a number of dissatisfied states who actually are hoping for, I think, basically a new opportunity. And they link their hopes with an expectation that one day, sooner or later, there might be another collapsing of international order, and therefore perhaps another rebalancing of powers, of external powers over and in the Western Balkans. And therefore, that these nationalisms are also promoting the idea of frozen conflict, for example, the sense of being victims, being excluded, not being understood, not being supported to the same degree to which, for example, some other nationalisms have. I think the other thing that feeds somehow nationalism in Southeast Europe is a popularity of sovereigntism, globally and especially in the European Union, in particular, I think, in the European inner periphery, internal periphery, therefore in countries of former Eastern Europe, for which actually I'm not entirely sure that now 30 and more years since 1989, we can say that their motivation for 1989 was primarily liberal. I think in many of these cases, actually the primary motivation was nationalist, was an idea of returning sovereignty from Soviet Union back home somehow. And I think the cases of Hungary and Poland show that. They show that, in fact, I wonder whether the initial inspiration for 1989 in these countries was liberalism. I think it was more actually nationalism in these cases, just like in Slovenia, but unlike in the other part of former Yugoslavia. And then thirdly, I think what we see is the sense of unfinished businesses in Western Balkans. And in particular, I have in mind three issues which introduce a degree of uncertainty. And uncertainty is always good, because with uncertainty, you need to give some response, you need to reassure people, you need to show the way how to deal with challenges that are inevitable in the future. These three uncertainties I would call uncertainty about disintegration, uncertainty about reintegration, and uncertainty about integration. Now, uncertainty about disintegration refers to the disintegration of Yugoslavia. Is this process now over or not? Is 6 or 7 post-Yugoslav states all? Or is this process still ongoing? And can we expect, fear and hope, depending on where we stand in political scale, that this process will continue with disintegration of further disintegration that would lead to more states in former Yugoslavia? The second thing is related to issue of reintegration of post-Yugoslav republics, now independent states, of which several had actually disintegrated at the same time when Yugoslavia did disintegrate. We sometimes forget that it was not only disintegration of Yugoslavia in 1991, it was a disintegration of Bosnia and of Croatia and of Serbia. And now we also have disintegration of Kosovo, which is de facto, whose borders, the jure borders are not the same as de facto borders. So I think all of them had to face some challenge of being reintegrated. And in those cases where there is external support for integration, it has happened to a degree. Whether this degree is now sufficient that we can say that the process is over, or whether it is still a process that is ongoing, that's a big question again. And I think the domestic nationalisms are very much focused on the issue of whether there should be more integration of Bosnia or less integration, whether there should be integration of Kosovo into Serbia, whether there should be integration of North Kosovo into Kosovo, and whether there should be some kind of integration locally into a kind of a new Yugoslavia called mini Schengen. These questions are now really in the focus of domestic nationalisms. And they, of course, differ very much on how they respond to some of these questions. Here we also have the issue of disintegration and reintegration of nations, which are now divided by new state borders, and within which there are also significant differences even within the same nation on particular key political issues. For example, those Serbs who now live in Croatia and those Serbs who now live in Serbia, there's a big question whether this is one nation or two nations. And the same issue we have with Albanians in Kosovo and Albanians in Albania, and so on and so forth. So we really have a serious question of whether there is still one nation. In some cases, such as, for example, with Bosnian Muslims, who are now in many cases divided into Bosniaks and Muslims with capital M, we actually have disintegration of a nation after the nation had changed the name in 1993. So is this still one nation or two nations? What happened with Bunjevci and Croats and so on and so forth? So we are reopening some of these issues which are still feeding nationalisms because they produce uncertainties. And finally, the third point that is the focal point for nationalism is an issue of integration in European Union. This process now looks like waiting for Godot and waiting for the train that will not come. And so for as long as this is the case, there is a strong sense of unfairness, inequality, exclusion, and to a degree, humiliation. Very good words and concepts for strengthening nationalist rhetorics and practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dejan. And I hand over to Sinisa.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jasna, for organizing this event and also to LSEE for hosting it. Dejan and Florian have focused more on the kind of political aspects of nationalism in the region. And being sociologist myself, particularly historical sociologist, I want to kind of take a little bit long-term view of these changes, focusing more on societies. Because obviously nationalism is not just a political doctrine, it's also a way of living. Something that is embedded very much in the institutions and everyday life. So I see nationalism in that sense as a historical phenomenon that develops and changes through time and space. And in order to understand what's happening now, we really have to look at these historical trajectories. They do make important tracts in understanding where we are now. So in that sense, I think nationalism is not only about agency and political elites and political parties, it's also about a structure. It's a structural phenomenon. So structural contexts make nationalism possible and durable. Without structures, without organizations, without kind of ideological penetration, nationalism would evaporate. So in that sense, we have to look at a little bit more at the kind of broader issue of how these trajectories change. It is also important for us to bear in mind, and Florian has talked a little bit about this, this is a global phenomenon. It is something that has been developing for the last 250 years. So in many respects, nationalism is a meta-ideology of modernity, has become very hegemonic in that sense, particularly after the Second World War. I mean, we live in a world of nation states. There are no empires anymore. There are no patrimonial kingdoms. There are no kind of city states. Everything else has been delegitimized. So as long as you live in a nation state, nationalism will always be there. It's not easy to kind of, because this is the way how nation states legitimize themselves. So in that context, we can take a look a little bit at the kind of Southeast Europe and what is kind of to some extent distinct about Southeast Europe is that nationalism developed here very late, kind of in late 19th century as a sociological phenomenon. So up to now, up to that period, we have dominance of imperial structures, and in many respects, they were legitimized using very different ideologies. So if you look, let's say very briefly, I'll kind of jump through the 19th century just to make a few points. If you look at, whether there was any nationalism in the 19th century, we have to look at the way, how coercive organizational structures were developed, and they were very underdeveloped. This was a region that was very late to modernize. It had a very poor infrastructure, very weak transport communication network networks. These are all important for kind of society, to link society, to link people between different villages. So once modernization started, it was very uneven. Focus was very much on military, on police, on administrative apparatus that was not very efficient, but was very expensive. So much of this state capacity was built, but it was quite weak for many years. So and was very much built on the money borrowed from West European states, France mostly. Then if you look in terms of ideological penetration of nationalism, this reason, it wasn't very deep. Imperial legacies were much more powerful. Religion mattered much more. Local attachments were much stronger than nationhood, clan, extended families, kinship networks, village communities. This is how people lived in everyday life. This is how they saw the world. Also very important, something that most theories of nationalism emphasize, illiteracy. If you don't have literacy, it's very difficult to build kind of cross-class identities. So what we see here, rampant illiteracy in Serbia, for example, 1864, 90% of the population is still illiterate. Even at the beginning of the 20th century, 83% illiterate in Serbia. In 1930, in Romania, 43% of Romanian adults were illiterate. This is also a society where you don't have a kind of mass educational systems, which are key vehicle of nationalization. You don't have standardized languages. You have lots of still dialects spoken. These are all kind of, there are no preconditions for nationalism, no so-called high culture, theaters, museums, academies, concert halls, libraries, theaters. These were all built mostly mid to late 19th century. So nationalism was quite weak in that sense. It was a elite phenomenon, very top-down thing. Narrow social strata was receptive to nationalist ideas. State bureaucracy, police, military, intellectuals. While majority of society here, we are talking about more than 90%, were essentially peasants, urban, poor population, and they were either ambiguous about nationalism or quite hostile. So what we have, they were generally anti-statist, which is a legacy of the empire. Also, very sympathetic to peasant populism. That's why a number of peasant parties were very influential in Bulgaria and Serbia and so on. Also very religiously conservative. So all of these are not good grounds for kind of nationalism. So what happened in the 20th century, this is a key period for development of nationalism. This is a development of the, it's a developmentalist state. Whether it was a communist or anti-communist, as in Turkey or Greece, they were key vehicles of modernization. So this is where people become, kind of integrated into society, when states penetrate society, and when nationalism kind of has foundations. So what we see, a lot of what's happening today resonates with what was happening in this time. I don't have time to go into details. I'll just switch now to the contemporary, to 21st century, what's happening now. So what we see now here, we have in terms of organizational structure, very robust, huge bureaucratic apparatuses. But they are obviously inefficient, corrupt, nepotistic, clientelistic, but they're enormous. Public sector in Serbia is about 600,000 people. In Croatia, about 400,000 people. States are very centralized. Most states are very centralized. They also have decent developed transport communication networks, so the societies are integrated. So you can spread nationalist ideas throughout society much easier. They have a very powerful, large coercive police apparatus. Croatia, about 20,000 police officers. In 1980s, it was half of that, around 11,000. Serbia, 43,000 policemen and women. In 1980s, it was about 16,000. Even Bosnia has a lot of huge police force in terms of numbers, about 17,000, and it was about 8,000 in the 1980s. So what we see is a big state, kind of huge state, but not very functional state, obviously. In some sense, state can penetrate society. So that's an important element for proliferation of nationalism. The second issue is the kind of ideological spread of nationalist ideas. And here, literacy has been achieved. Nearly all Balkan states have achieved full literacy. 99% Croatia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, around 98, even Bosnia, about 97. So these are preconditions for nationalism to spread easily. We have standardized languages. There was obviously re-standardization in 1990s in much of the former Yugoslavia. Cultural production very present, which is important in terms of called high culture, that you can kind of generate these nation-centric ideas and mythologies about nation. primary, secondary education compulsory, mostly it's a key channel for nationalization, socialization of young people to become aware of who they are and become, in that sense. Then we have something that Dejan has analyzed in his works, commemorations of previous wars, national tragedies. Every other day there is a commemoration, and this kind of constantly reminds you that you are Croat, you are Serb, you are Albanian, whoever you are. So this reinforces nation-centric views of present and past. But what's also important here is that, I think Dejan has also mentioned that to some extent in Florian, there is also deep ideological polarization. So nationalism is widespread, but it's also deeply polarized. So there is no consensus on the legacy of the Second World War. There is no consensus on period of state socialism in the former communist part of the Balkans. No consensus of the war in the 1990s. And I'm talking about within societies. Obviously, there is no consensus between societies because they fought each other, but within societies, there's a deep ideological polarization, which also provides vehicle for nationalist outbidding within different groups. So you can use constantly these elements to, emphasize your nationalism. And here, I'm not just talking about far right. You can have a left version as well, because everybody can use these discourses to make kind of nationalist claims. And nationalism, in some respect, is the key mechanism for you to legitimize yourself to wider audience. Then we see also divides in terms of generational divides. Younger people are mostly, have problems finding jobs and emigrating. They're also more influenced by world trends. And there is a division between urban and huge division, urban and rural areas, deep inequalities in what are essentially very impoverished societies with small middle classes. So that's why we have a huge emigration, brain drain. Half of the population of Bosnia lives outside of Bosnia, and this is the more educated part, for example. So obviously, impoverished populations seem to be more leaning towards exclusive nationalism. Then, some of the issues that have been raised by Florian and as well, importance of mass media, private mass media that are often controlled indirectly by political parties. And then can periodically invoke certain kind of extremist content, especially before the elections. But that's also done outside by the civil society, various groups within the civil society. So we see constant generational instability, production of fear, animosity, tensions are kept alive constantly. And then the last element is the kind of this micro element, which is also important, but hasn't been studied much. And this is the kind of the way how micro level solidarity is linked with this organizational ideological grounding of nationalism. And that's the kind of family life, the family and friendship networks. They are very important in this part of the world. People trust mostly their family members and friends. They don't trust the state. If you look at the various surveys, they're enormously low level of trust in state and government, around 20% maximum in Bosnia and Macedonia, which is much lower than OECD countries or EU. Younger people are the least trustful towards the state. So there is more trust, kind of in reliance on these family networks of support. And we know, for example, that Balkans have the largest number of young people living with the parents, this range between 18 and 35. In Montenegro, 77%, in Croatia, 75%, in Serbia, 72%, compared to Norway, let's say, where it's 21%. So it's people are dependent on their families rather than the state. They don't trust the state. So kinship and friendship networks are very important, and they are not penetrated by the state. State is distracted, seen as kind of corrupt and this other thing. So what we see here, we see deeply nationalized population. Most surveys show that people identify strongly with the nation, but they also distrust the state. So that's also the reason why nationalism is strong, because the state is, in that sense, has not penetrated the micro world. We see more nation and less state in some respects. So when we go back, you see that nationalism has really increased profoundly over the last 2 centuries, and these societies. I would agree with Dan in that sense that nationalism is very strong in that sense, but it's also unevenly grounded. So that's why it's so loud. There is a good quote by Mark Bessinger where he said that we should distinguish between nationalisms that bark and nationalisms that bite. This is a much more of a barking nationalism. It's very loud because it's insecure. In that sense, that's an important element to analyze. So I'll stop here now. I probably went over my time. Thanks, yes.
Well, thank you very much, Sinisa, Dejan, and Florian. We're starting to get questions coming in. What I will do is I will take about 3 questions at a time and sort of summarize what the questions are for you, and ask either the panel or individual speakers to speak. But before I do so, and while we're warming up with the questions, perhaps I could just ask you a very academic question in a sense, which is, in your view, this is to the panel, what has been the contribution of the study of nationalism in the Balkans for our general understanding of nationalism as a phenomenon? I don't really mind which order you want to go in. Just a brief answer, because we're now starting to get a lot of questions.
Shall I get started then, Jasna?
Yes, Florian.
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, I think that the scholarship of nationalism has greatly advanced in the studying the Yugoslav wars of the 90s. I mean, global study and understanding. And I think a lot of the debates, about, for example, whether nationalism is a bottom-up or top-down phenomena is something which was discussed in the context of the Yugoslav conflicts. And I think this is, a lot has been learned globally on that. And I think all of us have, done our own research on the Yugoslav case. And I mean, Sinisa more than all of us globalized or taken the lessons global in many way, or studied in a larger context. I think this is important. My point is also that we should study what is in the, nationalism in any particular part of the world, be it in Southeastern Europe, in a global context, and try to learn the lessons for larger phenomena. So, I mean, I think the processes, which also Sinisa was just pointing out now, are global, whether it's the literacy, whether it is the mechanisms in which nationalism is communicated, that it's very much often driven by elites, and all of these are not unique to in any way to the Yugoslav context. A lot of it was studied in that context, but it's not specific at all.
Thanks. Anyone else?
Well,
Dan.
I think we have here a great set of cases in a way in which we can to which we can actually apply some of these theoretical ideas. I mean, we here have first of all states that appeared on a map, and as I said earlier, some of them without even their population expected them or hoping it would happen or even knowing what to do with them. And actually their weakness to a large degree is a consequence of this confusion and suddenness of historical events which hit the population in Southeast Europe. But then we also have the attempts of the identity designers, as I call them, to shape and organize the nation and to sell the size of the state and the history of the nation and the history of the state to the general population with more or less success. And that's what they have been doing in the last 30 years. And as a result of this, as I said earlier, I think we now have much more consolidated nationalisms than they used to be back in the 1990s. In the 1990s, I mean, as for example, V.P. Gagnon said, I mean, the myth of ethnic war, books like that, I think very seriously, and I think they were quite right in pointing out that actually the interpretation that these wars were primarily ethnic should be challenged, and I think they were right, and the part of this was because there were also other motivations, many other motivations for people to commit violence in the war. And I mean, this is something that goes back to violence in wars in general, I think. I mean, we have now very good books on Berholtz, for example, on the Second World War violence, which, we also used to treat as inter-ethnic and inter-ideological, but in fact, there were very many other motives and circumstances. And I think that is something that we should also take from the Yugoslav studies forward, and then obviously apply to some other cases if they are similar, and certainly they are in comparative politics.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe I can jump as well. I think that there's a lot of what we have learned that has kind of impacted on nationalism studies from this region. Historically, there are all these kind of recent debates on national indifference and kind of the legacies of empire and the relationship between imperialism and nationalism, which are much more complex than they traditionally, traditionally we would just see imperialism and nationalism as mutually exclusive. And now we see that there's much more commonality. Then obviously the state socialist period and the relationship with nationalism has been also kind of questioned and analyzed. Before you would think, again, traditional conventional understanding was, communism was very anti-nationalist, but in reality, it was much more subtle, more complex relationship. And then obviously, the point that was made by Florian and Dejan about legacies of the wars of the 1990s have also impacted on recent debates and discussions of nationalism. So I think we can learn a great deal from the region and contribute to kind of general debate.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start trying to gather questions now. And I will start at the beginning. We have an interesting question from Liridonia Velu from Dublin City University. She's a PhD student currently in Illinois. And this is the US question to all speakers. She says, most recent academic trends have touched upon race in the Balkans. They claim that looking at the region through the predominant lens of nation nationalism is a reductionist endeavor. What is your view on this? And which, if any, phenomena in the Balkans would you consider as best viewed from a racist rather than a nationalist lens? Anyone want to have a go?
I mean, I can have a first stab. I mean, I think there's Catherine Baker's, of course, excellent book on that topic, which kind of really the first study which brings the debate to the region a few years ago. But I think it's not that, each lens is a lens. It gives a focus on what we study. So I think the study of race or the lens of race is a good supplement to the study of nationalism. It's not a replacement for it. And I think we can't look at relations amongst nations as through the lens of race. I think that's not very helpful. I mean, there are some relations in the Balkans which are studied helpfully through the lens of race. I think the view of mainstream societies of Roma communities, for example, I think is helpful to introduce the concept of race there, because it's not just of national difference or distinctiveness. Sometimes the relations between South Slavs and Albanians as well have a racialized undertones. And I think there it's very useful to include that, to realize that it's not just about nationalism, but there is a racialized kind of dimension to all of that. And then there's a larger question of, how does a place like a European, states which were not imperial position themselves in these larger debates about colonialism and post-colonialism is an interesting debate. But again, all of these are supplements or rather different perspectives, but I don't think they can replace the importance of nations and the study of nationalisms, but they're rather just another angle to study the region.
Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on race, or should we move on to other aspects? Okay. All right. I have a question here from Sven Milikic, Maynooth and Zagreb, a PhD student from both. And he has a question for Dejan and Sinisa. His question is, are nationalisms from ex-Yugoslav states actually a bit more formulated result of ethno-federalism, as Crawford described it, political elites that used mobilization in their republics to gain political power and controls over limited resources? And then for Dejan, is there a possibility that in those surveys in Croatia from 1990, the questions regarding state independence and interethnic relations, surveyed citizens answered what they thought they should respond, a kind of self-censorship? And finally, a question for all: will virulent ethno-nationalisms in ex-Yugoslav states ever transform into more of a Western type banal nationalism, or will militaristic forms of nationalism prevail in the long run? And this ties into a question from Vesna Popovsky, who says, didn't the political elite define the nation through the ethnic optic, and therefore was it not confused? For Dejan. And finally, Will Bartlett from LSEE asks, does rising income inequality in the nation states of the Southeastern Europe delegitimize the national project and nationalism rather than strengthening it? And this I would address to Sinisa in particular.
Okay, since I seem to get 2 or 3 questions, if I may just try to briefly answer. The first one is on ethno-federalism and organization of a nation and nationalism in socialist Yugoslavia. Yes, I think the socialist Yugoslavia, in fact, certainly was not a nation state, and it didn't aim at becoming a nation state. Instead, it was a specific form of political organization based around and founded around the ideology that involved, as you know, the concept of withering away of the state. But it also involved internationalism, and it was very solidly based on the Marxist and, in this particular case, Leninist and Stalinist interpretation of the concept of the nation and a nationhood. And indeed, in as much as socialist Yugoslavia was an internationalist project to some degree up until 1975 in particular, I think also with an option of being open for other members potentially or territories in the future should the socialist revolution happen and all these things. At the same time, it also recognized the existence of nations and gave them a kind of a quasi-state form through the declaring the socialist republics as sovereign nation states. They were not only that, they were also socio-political communities in which there is a self-management and everything that goes against the notion of people's and national sovereignty, but certainly in a form, it was national. In the contents, it was meant to be socialist. So I suppose it is therefore, I think you are right if you're suggesting that in fact this was the beginning of, or at least it was this form that connected the national ideas from the past to the 1990s. It kept the flame alive somehow during the socialist period, and it served as an institutional shell to organize new nation states and actually to supply it with also the cadre or the kind of civil servants and political leaders and so on and so forth. And I think therefore socialist Yugoslavia did not successfully eradicate nationalism. Nobody could. I mean, globalization will never defeat nationalism, and nationalism will never defeat globalization. I think they will coexist always to some degree. But in this particular case, it also had space for institutionalized socialist nationalism. So socialist nationalism meaning national informed socialist in contents, right? And I think that would be my guess, my answer to your question. The survey, well, you know, if it were the only source, I think we could have perhaps have some doubts about that. Although it actually was conducted in March 1990, when it was an anarchic situation. Nobody was in power. There was nobody to fear. I think in this particular, this was a brief moment in which actually you had such a situation in which, you know, I don't know who to fear really in March 1990. But what actually reaffirms the findings of this survey is the way the question on the referendum was formulated a year after that, in May 1991. It was quite obvious to me that unlike in Slovenia, in Croatia, the political elite did not dare to ask a simple question: do you want Croatian independence, yes or no? You know, the question was much more complex and much more complicated, deliberately so, because political leadership of Croatia, not even in May 1991, was sure that a question yes or no would result with a clear yes. And I think that's, for me, that's good enough. I think that, of course, the situation changes with the war, and the war served also to increase the desire for independence and to eliminate any alternative, including the confederal alternative. The war was very useful for separatists. And actually, it was the only way that they could actually get independence. Had it not been for Vukovar, I'm not sure that Slovenia would have ever been recognized internationally. And certainly, and Croatia would not. So I think without that war, which transformed the view of political actors abroad, I think we have a decisive change. For this in this sense, in Croatian nationalism is quite right when they say that without the war there would be no Croatia, there would be no independent or internationally recognized Croatia. And then the third question was about ethnic optic in interpreting the concept of a people, but I think I've already said enough in responding to this, so I'm leaving this to other participants.
Thank you. Sinisa.
Okay, I think I will answer first two. I didn't hear the third one. Maybe you can remind me what the third one was. The first one was the kind of the importance of a state socialist period, and I would argue that's the most important period for, in sociological sense, for development of nation-centric understanding of the world. Despite Yugoslav state being a kind of federal and socialist, I mean, what Dejan mentioned, you know, the kind of the Soviet idea of nationalist in form, socialist in content actually worked the other way around. It was a nationalist in content and socialist in form. And we have a lot of research, obviously, in the Soviet Union and other kind of Czechoslovakia and other places where we see, you know, much of the kind of recent research points out how central nationalism was for legitimacy of the state. So it was not necessarily kind of an ethnic form, but it was still a very much defining feature. I mean, the Yugoslav experience of fighting partisans in the Second World War, you know, you won the war. This was your legitimacy. Legitimacy was against the enemies, others, the foreigners, and the domestic traitors, essentially. So this is a language of nationalism. It might be a left-wing version, but it's a nationalism nonetheless. So this was an important legitimizing a principle on which you had then structural transformations that built population in becoming aware that they were never really Yugoslav, I mean, apart from mixed families, because Yugoslav communist party never really aspired to build a Yugoslav nation. I mean, we know that from Kardec very clearly. He was, you know, even when he was writing in the late 30s, you know, he wasn't aspiring to build a Yugoslav nation. So in that sense, we have to look at these structural changes, and that's the increased literacy rates, development of kind of infrastructural capacities. We have to look at the, you know, creation of so-called high culture, which was, you know, always national, but also in Yugoslav. So it had to be balanced. And then over the years, I mean, obviously, you know yourself, Jasna, have written about this kind of the importance of intellectuals and everything else. So nationalism was always there. You know, there was no, you know, the idea was to kind of try and control it rather than to abolish it. You couldn't abolish it because this is the way how all nation states, and I would disagree with Dan here, Yugoslavia was not a nation state, not in terms of ethnic nationalism, but it was not an empire. So we live in a world where the only entity that is legitimate is a nation state. Internally, how it's organized, it's a different thing. It could be a federal state, it could be anything like that. But the principle is there. It's not that you have one nation in a state. You have the idea that, you know, Yugoslavia is represented in international affairs as one entity. So the fact that it's internally diverse and the federal doesn't matter because it's not an empire, it's not a patrimonial kingdom, it's not a city state. It is a nation state, but not a national state, not a nationally homogeneous state. So that period is very important. And, you know, that's why we have these legacies, you know, in the 90s. It wouldn't happen if this did not, it wasn't the case. You wouldn't, you know, we had all these national academies and things like that. The second point was about banal and kind of nationalism. And I mean, the problem is some people think the banal nationalism is not aggressive nationalism. That's not the case. I mean, if you read Billig, you know, he's very clear, you know, that this is precisely because this nationalism is reproduced on an everyday basis, it can explode. I mean, you know, it shouldn't be confused that he said benign banal are not the same. This is not a benign nationalism. And that's what I also try to argue in my book. You know, you shouldn't separate aggressive and banal nationalism. They're part of the same family. So precisely, you know, the dominant nationalism is always this everyday banal because it's constantly reproduced. That's why it can explode. You know, these are not two different things. So I mean, we saw that obviously in the, you know, there is no Western, you know, the distinction between civil and ethnic has been questioned for many years. So saying that Western nationalism is some sort of a, you know, cuddly, nice nationalism, that's not the case. We saw that in the US with Brexit and everything, how easily these things can explode. So this distinction is really not very useful in that sense of, you know, distinction between Eastern and Western. So that would be my response. I don't know what was the third question.
The third question was about income inequalities and whether they delegitimize the nationalist project or strengthen it.
I mean, it depends again on the context. They can be used, and they have already been used very much to. So instead of talking about issues such as jobs and blah blah blah, you talk about enemies and project these problems. But nationalism can be strengthened, like in the case of Denmark or Finland or Iceland, or kind of these economically prosperous societies where nationalism is kind of more embedded, but kind of prosperity brings a more attachment to the state. I mean, this is Gellner's point. Gellner's point was that there are two sources for legitimacy in modernity: economic growth and nationalism. So if you have these two combined, you're a prosperous state. So you cannot get rid of nationalism. It's just a question of what kind of nationalism will be, how you can contain it.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to take another set of questions. The first one is from Nicola Minazzi, who is the Italian ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina. And he's asking, would not a renewed call for brotherhood and unity of Yugoslav times be a useful bridge to the EU? What went wrong with that and how to re-evaluate it? Florian, I'd like you to take this one. And then a related sort of question about alternatives is from Denisa Kostoviceva from the LSEE, who says, given your views on nationalism, what can you tell us about political and social forms and space of anti-nationalism? And how might this have changed since the early 1990s? This is to all speakers. And finally, Peter Frostad from King's and LSE, what kinds of changes do need to be made to democratic institutions at the local, regional, and national levels to make citizens feel as though their voice matters? So these are the sort of three questions around alternatives and possibilities. I wonder if, Florian, you might want to take those.
Thanks a lot, Jasna. First, to answer Ambassador Minassi's question, I mean, it kind of also addresses the other questions, is, what are the alternatives to nationalism? And I mean, even the terminology already betrays the difficulties, because, anti-nationalism doesn't suggest what it is, it just suggests what it isn't or what it is against. And I mean, with the disappearance of Yugoslavia, there, which, had some ability to identify other than ethno-nationalist, to have a state identity, let's say, there wasn't an alternative. And we see this also in the identity categories. You cannot be a Croat of Croatia in a census or in the public discourse without being assumed that you are Croatian in the sense of ethnic belonging, and the same is the case in Serbia. And even in Bosnia, yes, there are many Bosnians, but if you look at the census results, there are very few Bosnians in Bosnia. I mean, there are lots of Bosniaks and Serbs and Croats, but this identity character kind of criteria of Bosnian is not that widely accepted, although this is maybe a place where you could identify with the state without having the immediate label of a nation attached to it, the claim of but otherwise, again, you cannot be, I mean, it's hard to be an Albanian in Macedonia and to say I'm Macedonian. And I think this is the difficulty of how do you define an alternative. And this, you could say I'm European, but that seems a bit kind of trite and also problematic when you're outside of the European Union. Of course, non-EU citizens are also Europeans, but as an identity category, it's hard to see how one can belong to something which is often defined exclusively for a project which you're not part of. So I think this is the difficulty, is that brotherhood and unity had also these, I think, as Dejan said, also very strong Marxist ideological connotation. It couldn't be rescued as easily from that particular historical episode. So I think this is the difficulty. What is the language of non-nationalism? And I think there we're having a gap. And maybe Europeanness is an alternative, but it's a bit too broad and vague to really offer the kind of concrete identification which people might like to see. And again, also this Europeanness has also been claimed by nationalists. I mean, it's not that you can be a very good Hungarian or Croatian or German nationalist and see yourself as European, defending it against the Muslim invaders, as the far right in their discourse do. So I think this is the difficulty: is how do you capture? And I think the space has evaporated. And this is why I mean, what Sinisa has been argue of this kind of the idea that we're living in a nationalist world where this is the reality. So you can redefine the nation. So I think this is more the arena where this competition takes place of how permissive, exclusionary, and violent do you define your national identity? Do you see I'm a Croat, but that means I can accept citizens of different faith and mother tongue in that nation, or do I define it exclusionary? And this is where most of the debates take place, and the kind of other ones are maybe supplementary layers, but not alternatives in the everyday lived experience of most people.
Thanks. Anyone else would like to weigh in on these questions? Okay. All right. So we'll move on to the next set of questions. I have a question here from Neil Gandhi from the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and he asks, what is the likelihood of nationalism moving from bark to bite? And what are the ways to reduce this nationalism towards bark? So considering that you use this, this quote, Sinisa, why don't you give this a go? And then if anyone else wants to weigh in. So that's the first question. Okay. Then I will take, there's a question from Nenad Zakošek from the University of Zagreb, who says, again, this is a question now for all speakers. Do you see a difference in dynamics of nationalism in Southeast European countries that have completed state building, such as Slovenia and Croatia, and those countries where state building is still open, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, Kosovo, North Macedonia? So that's the second question. And sorry, there was another question that yes. So there is a question from Sam Pryke, Wolverhampton University. Does the beginning of the passing of the Yugoslav generation have any significance for the region? Or was Yugo-nostalgia, born of a common culture and appreciation of the benefits of the common federal state, never really something that had real political significance, only a curiosity anyway? So this is a question on sort of the legacies of Yugoslavism in the region. So let's start with Sinisa and then move on to Dejan and Florian.
Okay, so the distinction between the barking and biting, obviously it's a metaphor, but it can capture many different things. One is barking in this particular case indicates weakness. Essentially you cannot achieve certain things, and therefore you are very aggressive. So it is a sign of insecurity. And we can kind of contrast that again with the example of maybe some nationalisms like Finnish or Danish, which is biting, but more in terms of sort of a nationalist attitude towards the immigrants. So in a sense, you don't have to do anything, but you introduce certain restrictive measures and, kind of police people in a particular way, which might be a particular form of biting nationalism, which is not necessarily good. But you can use biting metaphor, obviously, for explosion of nationalism in times of war, and that obviously what has happened with once the Yugoslav state, when it collapsed. So I mean, they may not necessarily be a good thing that you move from one to another. It's just, I think they're useful metaphors in kind of trying to organize these ideas and see what's happening in particular society. The second question about the Yugoslav generation, I think that's a very good question. In a sense, it's worth exploring this, doing some really kind of proper sociological research to see how young generation see this legacy. And I imagine a lot of this has to do with the family traditions. People are very much aligned, their family. I mean, this is like third or fourth generation of people who fought in the Second World War on different sides, tend to be, more sympathetic or more hostile to Yugoslav heritage. So obviously, generation that grew up in Yugoslav times, like Dejan and myself, I don't know, Jasna, if we're around, we do obviously have all these kind of memories and we know exactly what was happening, but the new generation, they might build these kinds of a sense of what this was, which can be kind of idealized as a form of Yugo-nostalgia, But you know, we also encounter a lot of kind of interaction between young people, you know, across these societies. So there are groups which are very hostile because they often are part of these families which have a very different understanding of the Yugoslav times. And then you have this third or fourth generation who grew up in, you know, kind of having this positive attitude towards that period, and they continue to do that. I mean, obviously, this is something that has to be explored properly to see how this works. But it is an interesting. I don't think once this older generation dies out that this whole project will disappear. I think it will still be there in a different way.
Dan, maybe you would like to come in.
Yes, right. The new the bark to bite aspect. I think the nationalism, but that goes for any other doctrine or ideology or political program, has a potential of getting dangerous when there is a collapse of the state and or of international order, and especially when it happens at the same time, which was happening in Yugoslavia in 1989. And I think this brief moment of anarchy and chaos was very dangerous, and even weak new alternative ideologies and a relatively small number of people following them with extreme views and intentions managed to be successful in circumstances like that, especially when they were tolerated and supported by actors which were willing to provide weaponry, which is, I think, precondition for starting a serious bite. And I think this is what we had. We had actually collapsing of international order in Europe. We had collapsing of Yugoslav state. We also had collapsing of Croatian, Bosnian, Serbian republics. And we had, so therefore, nobody to stop extremists. And then also we had various parts of the former state apparatus becoming available to various extremists and linking with them and arming them from within and then opening the borders for the outside. So I think these are the circumstances. In other circumstances, they can certainly be successful when it comes to discrimination, hate speech, violent acts against individuals and ethnic minorities and various groups, migrants and everyone they don't like or support. I mean, whoever they think they are, they would usually call them, you know, Serbs if they are in Croatia, or I don't know, whatever, Ustashi if they are in Serbia, or Shqiptars or something like that. They would label them ethnically, even if some of these groups that are to be discriminated, although often they have nothing to do really with ethnic groups, just in order to insult them and to link them with this bigger narrative. But I can't see, for as long as the state is sufficient to stop violence, I don't see this really happening. Now, the new generation, that's an interesting question, because I mean, all of us who teach the new generation know that we now have students who not only that they don't have personal memories of Yugoslavia, communism, but they don't even have now personal memories of Milosevic. And so this is like students born in 2000, you know, now they don't really, that's the history, that's a history for them. It's not for us, of course, but it is for them. And I think there is a difference. I mean, from a personal experience of teaching both in Zagreb and Belgrade, I think there is a slight difference between these two cases, because in Croatia, Yugoslavia was over 30 years ago. And so therefore, I think we really now have a new generation for a while, which was born after Yugoslavia and largely educated and taught in schools and so on and so forth negatively of Yugoslavia. And they are now in a situation that when they really want to find some alternatives to the dominant narratives, they also look at the Yugoslav experience as a source of inspiration for alternatives, some of them. They also go further in the past, so that they look to NDH, for example, as well. So we have this, you know, the Ustašophilia, but also Yugoslavophilia, in a way, as a form of resistance to the dominant, overwhelmingly supported state-organized and imposed narratives. And also ideological differences. We have, you know, right-wing rising, but also left-wing rising in a way in this new generation, I think. When it comes to Serbia, however, I think this distance from Yugoslavia this is a shorter period of time. And so, for example, Yugoslavia for young students in Serbia really ended in 2006, not before that. And I think this is still the early stages, early period. I see the difference after 2012 with Vučić coming to power and basically reshaping the national identity for Serbia that would be as much detached from Yugoslavia as possible. So what we see now is like building monuments to Stefan Nemanja and Serbianizing the Yugoslav history somehow, right? Especially during the Second World War and so on and so forth. And I think we now really are in this phase, which I think in Croatia was actually it happened, let's say 1997, 1999, 2000 maybe, but not after that. I think what's also interesting is how the Croatian state now, faced with a new generation of people who have no memory of the homeland war, the big myth that organizes Croatian national identity now, how they try to transfer that narrative onto the new generation. And I see some interesting parallels with the Yugoslav communists who were trying to do this back in 68, 70 through a new generation wave of films and music and monuments and stories and educational programs. I think the Croatian nationalists are doing the same because they are a little bit worried about how the new generation will respond to old stories.
Thank you. Okay, Florian, would you like to add anything here, or would you, because there's a number of questions here that I think will...
Let's take a few more questions if we can.
Okay, so there are lots of excellent questions, by the way. I cannot possibly get through all of them, but there have been a number of questions about the influence of the external environment. So, for example, Nada Zečević from Goldsmiths asks, how do you assess the influence from abroad to the reinforcement of the region's neo-nationalisms? So that's a general question. Then there are more specific questions about, for example, Luisa Riberi, who is a graduate student at the LSEE. She asks, following High Representative Insko's remarks at the Security Council last month on the concrete risk of a new partition or disintegration of Bosnia in the coming years, how likely is this scenario to take place? And should the international community or the UN or NATO, or all, I suppose, intervene again in the region? And how should they do this? So in terms of policy. Then there is Damir Vučević, who is at the University of Illinois, who has a question again about the recent proliferation of non-papers. And he asks, in your views, what is the international community more likely to support? Status quo, redrawing of borders, mini Schengen, or something else? So we're looking at the basically the impact of external environment and actors, both in the sort of recent past and also in terms of policy and future policy. So we have 5 more minutes, so I would propose to end with a sort of a roundup on these questions around external actors and policy implications. So Florian, would you like to start on that, please?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Jasna. Yes, I mean, I think, let me answer this in 2 ways. I mean, one is the international order or the European order and the system which we're talking about, which was established at the end of the wars, which was primarily about recognizing republican borders and not engaging in new territorial boundary making. Kosovo, the partial exception as not being a republic but a province, but still no internal boundaries were kind of created. And the idea of kind of squaring the circle between the claim of nation states and still trying to keep states somewhat multinational and multi-ethnic. And this was the paradigm of the last, decades, really. And so in that sense, it kind of harks back to what Dejan was saying. The question is how permissible is the environment seen by those who would like to redraw the borders or in a certain way create more homogeneous nation states or new nation states? How much do they see it's possible, or are they waiting? So there's this is the question. And I don't think there's the willingness of international actors to let go of this order. They are, of course, challengers, and we see them, who would like to see this question. But the question is more, is the current system collapsing like it did in 1989, where we had a recalibration of global power? I don't see it yet happening. Of course, it's much more gradual process of reshifting of power relations, but I don't think it's going to pay out in Southeastern Europe with such a strength, considering also the existence, and I'm quite confident, the survival of the European Union. The second part of that question is the question of ideas, and I think there it's more about what is this Europe based on? And there, of course, we do have a competition over ideas. We have a much more, let's say, nationalist, isolationist view of Europe, which echoes in the region as well, and which again can work as an encouragement. I don't think this is necessarily going to change the borders of the region, but it does show that, of course, it always keeps this door open. And I think this is what I'm trying to say in the beginning. It's not the next tensions and conflict is not going to be a reiteration of the 1990s, because, as Dejan said, there aren't the weapons around today as they were in the 1990s. There isn't the kind of larger international context around, but I think this kind of attempt of undoing the order, the kind of post-war order at the seams, is something which seems quite possible. And I don't see the kind of more vibrant liberal world order represented by what has been called the international community, which long ago doesn't exist anymore, really standing up to protect it, at least in places where it might feel like it can live with a gradual erosion. And I think this is maybe the biggest potential for this gradual erosion in the region. Thank you.
Sinisa, would you like to go second, and then we'll conclude with Dejan?
Okay. I mean, this is not my expertise, sort of.
Yes, I know.
But I mean, obviously, the kind of geopolitical context matters a great deal. It influences domestic politics and the way how the political parties and leaders can play out. I mean, and everything what Florian said makes complete sense to me in terms of, you don't really have a hegemon in kind of as you used to before, and now you have big influence of other powerful states like China, like now obviously Turkey, Russia, the EU in a kind of weakened situation after Brexit, and then potentially the UK as an independent actor. So all of these will play an important part in how nationalism develops in the region, but it will be more diverse. The future is much less predictable now than it was maybe 15, 20 years ago.
Thank you. Dan? And I'm afraid this is going to be the final intervention of the evening.
and a very short one. Well, I'm very critical of how the European Union, and in particular some states, including in the first place Germany, acted in 1990, 1991. Now they were solving their own problem with unification and disappearance of the state and that sort of things. Of course, why should they think about the impact of that somewhere else? And the impact, unfortunately, it seems to me to be quite negative. However, I think the solution today is to continue with the presence of the external actors, particularly European Union, which is the only political organization that could actually turn some of these states that feel they are objects into semi-subjects within the European Union, and offer them, through membership in the European Union, guarantees for safety and survival. I mean, that's how they would see the membership in the European Union. And I think it should happen to all countries at the same time, immediately. And I think it would be a good way to limit their national sovereignty. Limitation of national sovereignty in a post-war period is a good thing. And I think that is, so therefore I think the European Union can still, if it wants to, be an anti-war actor, which is something that originally it planned to be, in fact.
Okay, well, that's it. 6:30 on the dot. Thank you very much. There are many other questions. In fact, we have about 40 questions altogether and comments, if you want to have a look. But our discussion this evening is now finished. And I would like to reiterate my thanks to all three of you. It's been an absolutely fantastic panel and discussion, and I have personally learned a lot, and I'm sure our spectators have as well. I encourage you to read all their books and recent outputs. and good evening to all. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jasna.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Good night.